Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest. He's back on for the second time, Eric Trexler. He was just on, I think, end of September. So welcome back on. And yeah, thank you for taking time out of your day again to come back on the podcast.
I genuinely cannot believe it was the end of September. I thought it was like 3 weeks ago. Like I'm genuinely jarred by that.
Me
Um,
too.
yeah. Well, thanks for having me back. I really appreciate it. Happy to be here. And I this is either gonna go really well or really poorly. Um, Busy time of month. I technically slept, but I'd call it more of a nap than a night of sleep. So I could just be like perfect conversational stream of consciousness, or I just might not have any working neurons, and we're gonna find out.
I can totally relate to that. It's like one of those things where you either that lack of sleep either really gets you in the groove and you can like find that extra gear, or you're just like nothing you say makes sense.
Yeah, we'll let the audience judge. We'll take a poll.
Yeah, no, I'm with you too. I was looking through like some topics to chat about today. And I was kind of going through, I like to go through math and just see if there's anything that like I read in the last couple of months that really sparked my interest. And I was like, oh, October, I definitely had them on since then. But as I was looking through it, I was like, damn, no, that was the end of September. So pretty crazy. Like you said, time's just flying by. So I guess before we dive into those topics, I want to just briefly hit on this. Is there anything that uh, has gone on since that time frame? I mean, it's been 2.5 months or so. I don't know if anything crazy's happened or if you have anything different that you're focusing on or anything like that.
No, I think there is some seasonality in the fitness industry. Well, there's certainly seasonality, right? I mean, a lot of people during the winter, they're bulking up. During as it's getting closer to the summer months, they're cutting down. New Year's is obviously a big time for goal setting. And so I think in the months since we've talked, I've been leaning into uh, doing more stuff in preparation for New Year's. So doing more content about foundational elements of constructing a diet, doing more information about how to set goals, how to change behaviors, how to cultivate motivation. So, really more on the health psychology side of things, and then just the nuts and bolts, the basic stuff of cleaning up a diet. Now, I try to be really mindful of not pushing people toward any particular goal. But mathematically, the numbers are what they are. A lot of people are going to focus on fat loss, and there's nothing wrong with that in the new year. And so a lot of my content does then drift into how to build a diet, how to get motivated, how to change behavior, and different strategies to support satiety, as obviously hunger becomes a big issue, or a noteworthy consideration when people are doing fat loss diets. So that's mostly what I've been up to. And of course, we've got the Macro Factor Diet app. And, we typically do have like, there aren't a lot of folks who the day before Thanksgiving are like, you know what I need is a diet app, right?
Yeah.
But as we kind of get into the new year, we do expect there's going to be a lot of fresh faces, and we want to make sure that we're supporting them the best we can with some content.
Awesome. Yeah, no, you're 100% right there. It's like you don't want to push anybody towards a particular goal, but definitely around the new year, that's where you see a lot of people get into fitness, and the big thing there is weight loss. So you might as well, really help out those people that need that information, right? Rather than grabbing who knows what kind of diets or whatnot they'll find on social media and on the internet.
Yeah.
And I know I just listened to your newest podcast episode. I know you said you are going to lay out, like you said, goal setting and then like things that are going to help people hit with that weight loss goal and whatnot. So Stronger by Science podcast is where you can hear that, I guess, over the next couple of weeks and whatnot. You'll be getting those things ready for that.
Yep.
And I think goal setting is huge too. I'm glad that you guys hit on that because that is something that like the psychology of it, I feel like is really overlooked, especially when it comes to like, I feel like the evidence-based crowd, we're all like numbers and like, particular diets and stuff like that. But that goal setting in the psychology side of things, I think is just super important, a super important part of the process.
And if I could reflect on that a bit, I got into fitness purely from a physiology perspective,
Yeah.
very, very heavy emphasis on physiology. And early in my career, with the best of intentions, I found myself often being frustrated by when people are struggling to cultivate motivation. It's like, well, no, I can put together the right training program for you, and I can put together the right diet that is technically correct for you, but like with motivation, like you just have to make this happen. And the thing that's funny about evidence-based fitness is everyone is so critically locked into the physiology side of the evidence, and no one wants to wade through the psychology papers, the motivation papers, the behavior change papers. That has been the biggest transition in my career is at some point I had to stop being stubborn and stop letting it frustrate me and say, okay, well, if I really believe in evidence-based practice, there is a body of evidence for this. I don't want to dig into it, but I literally have to. Like, otherwise, I'm just a hypocrite. Like, there is evidence for solving these problems, and you have to dig into it. You have to wrestle with it. And so that's been, while the initial process of diving into it was like, I mean, whenever you kind of start peeking into a completely different field, um, at first it can be overwhelming, but you kind of have to rip the band-aid off and say, okay, it's time to actually dig into this, because if we believe that scientific evidence helps us solve problems, that's what we got to do.
Yep. Yeah. It's right. It's not just the fitness side of things and the nutrition stuff. It's also digging into the research on the psychology side of things. And I'm glad you're doing that because I don't think I could sit there and go through all that. So I'll just get all my goal setting information from you and let you go through all that boring research there on that side of things. Have you found any of it to
I don't
be?
blame you.
Have you
What's
found
that?
any of it to be interesting or
Eventually, yeah.
yeah?
So I mentioned at first the feeling was a little bit overwhelmed of like, okay, how do I get my bearings? So every now and then I'll have someone message me on Instagram about like really critically interpreting a single study. And not to be dismissive, rude, disrespectful, anything like that, but it's very clear that they have not laid a basic foundation of understanding nutrition. And sometimes I do have to just kind of gently nudge them and say, you really, for it's in your best interest to zoom way out, cover the fundamentals, and then dive back into this research. And so that's why I had to do it for myself, which was humbling. So I started with textbooks and basically said if I were in a 300, 400 level psychology course, give me the foundation. And so, I mean, I've got sitting, where'd my book? Oh, yeah, over there. I've got a stack of like 6 or 7 psychology textbooks, specifically health psychology, that I kind of trudged through. And then I said, okay, now it's time to start with narrative reviews, and then meta analyses once I kind of get an idea of what I'm looking for, and then critiquing individual studies from there. So it's a process. You have to follow that through. And once I felt like I really had my feet underneath me and I had my bearings and I felt anchored by some core principles and some key theories and models, then it becomes fun and it becomes fulfilling and rewarding and fruitful. But if I just dove right in and said, okay, here's an individual trial with 75 people, what happened? I mean, it would be a disaster. It'd be an absolute mess. You'd have no ability to fully contextualize that isolated finding within the broader literature.
Which is probably what a lot of people do when it comes to nutrition and the fitness side of studies as well too. They just get that one study and then that's kind of what they go off of when it's like you need to have that baseline and look at the bigger picture of everything as well too.
Yeah.
Cool. For your training and nutrition, is there anything that has changed there in the last couple months? Do you tend to just find yourself maybe focusing a little bit more on like the work side of things during this period of time and just enjoying life, or is it, what does that look like for you?
So yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I'm being a bit of a hypocrite lately, working myself to the bone. Not a lot of me time, not a lot of gym time. It is a decision I made. You know, there's pros and cons to it. I'm comfortable with it. I've actually kind of decided that I really want to lean into like a fresh start at the new year. And one of the reasons I want to do that is because I think it will be a really eye-opening experience where I can work in parallel of
Yep.
navigating some of the challenges of people who are just picking things up at the new year. It's kind of like jumping in with a cohort and literally following the same time course with them as they're getting back into things. So in past months, I've had some injury issues. I've got a nerve issue that's been really, really challenging to train around. But I work with Jason Yor, who's our physical therapist at Stronger by Science. He's a magician. Like he's absolutely incredible. He's been so helpful. Um, I haven't been necessarily the model client in terms of keeping up with what I'm supposed to do, but he's been incredible. But yeah, between injuries and workload, I basically said, you know what? I'm actually almost as kind of a bit of an experiment. I'm comfortable letting myself get pretty detrained. And I want to jump into this when a huge cohort of people are jumping into this. And I want to do it in parallel, side by side, and run into the same challenges at the same time, and hopefully make some content that kind of follows along with that as well.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I know that PT work is just super tedious and boring, so I don't blame you on that one. Not one to get that done.
Yeah, you don't get to look in the mirror and see your biceps all pumped up, and you're like,
Yep.
"I this rehab for a nerve entrapment isn't particularly fun."
Does the detraining literature in terms of like knowing what kind of happens there, does that kind of put you a little bit more at ease with the process? Where if this was like 10 years ago or further out, would you be a little bit more uncomfortable with like taking this period of time away?
I will say, probably the worst thing that ever happened to me from a training perspective is actually looking into the detraining and retraining literature.
Yeah.
Once you have the confidence that like, oh, I can get this back like literally anytime, it's great for your mental health. It is a really positive, refreshing thing. But I mean, I remember in my younger years, I would skip like really necessary medical treatment because they would say, well, if you get this procedure done, which you absolutely need, you're going to have to not work out for 2 weeks. And I'm like, but that would be 8 years of training down the drain. And it's
Yeah.
like, it's not, it's clearly not if you look at any of the evidence. But yeah, so I mean, in my earlier years, it was completely irrational, but it was good for gains. Like I was absolutely terrified to miss a workout. So guess what? I didn't. So yeah, one of the worst things that ever happened to my consistency was the peace of mind of knowing, oh, you actually don't lose all your gains in 10 days. And whatever gains you lose in 10 days, you can get back in 5, and yeah, there's pros and cons to knowing that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that
And the pros
it's
outweigh the cons a lot. I should be clear.
100%. Yeah, no, I agree with you because I was there in the same boat as you too, where it was like, man, I would just, like you said, if for me, it was like not doing anything outside of like lifting, where it was like, oh, if I go do cardio or if I take a day off or I take a week off, it's like, oh no, I'm going to lose all my gains. But it's like, it's a really hard process to lose it. And then, like you said, even if you do lose a little bit in that process, man, it's just easy to get it back and it comes back quick. And I'm sure it's probably fun to see that happen pretty quickly like
Yeah.
that too. So,
Yeah.
cool. Awesome. Well, let's dive into the topics today. Like I said, I have three. We'll see if we can get to all of them in the time that we have. But first was just protein requirements and satiety. So I wanted to bring this up because I haven't really dove too much into this with a guest before. And I've been there myself where I've kind of preached protein as this like magic macronutrient. And, it's kind of this God macro. And so I just want to go over, some things I know you've talked about recently on Stronger by Science. I know Eric Helms has had some stuff on the satiety. So I just kind of wanted to talk about maybe how, protein is important, but maybe that it's not as important as we think it might be. So I guess we'll start out with the satiety side of things. Or is there anything that you want to add to before we go into the topic a little bit more?
No, I mean, yeah, the satiety is really a great place to start, I think. And then we can kind of talk about just like general recommended ranges for intake.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I was definitely one of the folks who back in the day uh, was really convinced that like a high protein diet was necessarily, a really, really massive impact on satiety. Like it was just a shortcut to permanent fullness. Hunger clearly is going to be kept at bay no matter what on a high protein diet. And over the years, my perspective has shifted on that a little bit. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a fully untrue idea. And in fact, I don't believe that to be the case. But my perspective has shifted for two reasons. I mean, one has been personal experience. I've been in situations as a bodybuilder where hunger happened despite a very high protein intake. So that was an eye-opening experience, obviously. And then looking at the literature and just kind of critically reading the research. I think the biggest lesson that I learned in the research over the past couple years is that protein per calorie does tend to be more satiating than carbohydrate or fat. And so what that means is it's going to do a better job helping you attenuate hunger per calorie. And that's a valuable thing. We shouldn't lose sight of that, and we shouldn't neglect to use that information. But when you look into the research, it gets a little more complicated. Uh, there's two things that I think are primarily complicating that relationship. Number one would be there appears, it's a little inconclusive, but the data seem to be trending that way. It appears that we kind of adjust to the transient satiety increase that is experienced when we bump up our protein. So, like when we first make a big jump in protein, we will notice right when that change occurs a pretty big increase in satiety and a reduction in hunger, but that effect seems to diminish to some extent over time. It doesn't mean it fully disappears, but it definitely wears off a little bit where it's no longer a novel change in our dietary pattern. And so to me, I think it's important to realize that if you're trying to leverage an increase in protein to boost satiety, you do have kind of a window where it's going to be the biggest impact you're going to get from it, and that will kind of slowly wane over time. So that's one thing to consider. It's not like we can just, I mean, dieting would be a very different thing if we could just say, oh, bump your protein by 30 grams and you're not going to get hungry anymore. It's pretty great. So unfortunately, that's not the case. Another thing that I think is even more important to consider from my perspective is that the macronutrient composition of a food is one thing that can impact satiety. But if we think about two very extreme examples, and we'll pretend calories are matched, macronutrient content is matched, you've got your favorite ready to drink protein shake. It is very evenly mixed, great texture, great flavor. You really, really enjoy it. It's a very appetizing drink that you really enjoy drinking. You compare that to, an equivalent serving that is just dry, unseasoned chicken breast. The satiety impact and the impact on appetite and desire to eat from those two things is going to be remarkably different. And why? Why would they be different? Well, there are, of course, differences in palatability. One tastes great. You'd love to drink two instead of one. The other one tastes kind of crappy. You finish one, you say, "Oh, that was dreadful. If you offered me a second, I'd turn it down." Right? So palatability, taste, flavor, that's important, but also texture. The actual energy density, the physical mass and volume of the food, even just the state, liquid versus solid. These are, textural and physical differences in these food items that really impact the way we respond to them in terms of satiety, appetite, desire to eat. And I use all those because they're slightly different things. And what I usually find, honestly, is that most people who are dieting, when they say, I really want a strategy to increase satiety, sometimes that's true, but usually they're kind of misattributing the term satiety. What they really want is a reduction in desire to eat. And so that's something that goes beyond macronutrient profile. It goes beyond just kind of single variables. We really have to think of the full matrix of the food or beverage, this kind of composite set of characteristics that determine not just how does this impact hunger, but also how do I feel when I'm done with the meal? Do I want more, or am I like, it was fine, but I'm good, right? And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, it's, oh, I can't even finish this. It's terrible. So the challenge when dieting, of course, we can leverage higher protein intake. We can get some benefit from that for satiety, for specifically satiety as a specific construct. But when we're actually talking about making a diet a little bit easier, then we have to start talking about the texture of the food, the energy density of the food, the flavor profile of the food. And ideally, what we would like to do to support satiety and to reduce desire to eat, of course, we don't want our meals to be totally unpalatable. That sucks. And it's just not going to be a sustainable way to eat. It has to be palatable enough that it's not a chore to eat the meal. But we kind of want to straddle that line where it's like not so palatable that you want a second, a third, a fourth serving. So we have to think about palatability. We have to think about energy density. And we also have to think about texture. So ideally, we'd like something with low energy density and a harder texture, or a texture that requires us to chew more, to eat more slowly. Those things seem to actually be important. And the slower eating rate, the increased chewing, those things, it does seem like slower eating rates give some of our satiety hormones more of a chance to kind of relay signals of fullness to the brain. So that's one thing. But also, there's been some interesting research indicating that there's also kind of sensory and memory related mechanisms at play where when we just take that protein shake, gulp, 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 and it's gone. It's like we almost don't even process the fact, oh yeah, we did savor some really nice flavors there, and we even got some aromas, and we remember the process of having that satisfying eating experience. Versus you go back, cut it up, chew, 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 swallow, go back, cut. This is not exactly invigorating audio to listen to if I keep going, but you get the idea. So the biggest thing is that, does protein increase satiety? If I had to give a yes or no answer, it'd be yes. But is that the whole story? Definitely not.
Yeah, I like that you brought both those up because, and like you said, I fell into this too, where it's like, oh, you just need to eat more protein. But like you said, the choice of that protein, I think, is going to be very important is well too. And I know that I can't think of the study. I don't know it offhand, but I'm sure if I explain it, you'll probably remember which one it is. They had the like white bread, and then they kind of talked about what the satiety was of foods compared to like white bread. And it's kind of interesting that like some carbohydrates were actually just as satiating as like certain proteins were, and then like some proteins were actually lower than certain carbohydrates as well too on that. So like you said,
Yeah.
kind of thinking about more of like actual food versus just protein can be super helpful there.
Yeah, I mean, so I believe the paper you're referring to is about the satiety index by Holt and
Cool.
colleagues back
Yeah.
in the late 90s, or might have been the mid 90s. But yeah, I mean, it's really funny because it did push back against a lot of common like heuristics and assumptions, right? So one of the really surprising, very satiating foods was just a plain white potato. And a lot of people say, oh, starches, you overeat them. Anything white, white flour, white noodles, white bread, it's all bad. And the white potato actually was very, very satiating because, sorry, I'm going to sneeze.
You're good.
Pardon me. Because, I mean, who wants to eat like a giant plate of just boiled plain white potatoes with no salt, no pepper, no sour cream, no cheese, no bacon bits, like whatever people are putting on potatoes these days. Yeah, I mean, we do have to really think carefully about the entire set of characteristics that a food has beyond its macronutrient content.
Yeah, like you said, there's so many things at play there. Like you said, if you compare that protein shake to the chicken breast, that's going to play a big difference in terms of the satiety of that. And then you also hit on, there's kind of like this, it's almost like kind of the repeat about effect, I feel like, of for protein when it comes, exercise, you do it a couple times, it doesn't have the same effect. And that was one thing that I found really interesting, was that there seems to be this kind of period where your body adjusts to it. And then after a while, that starts to wear down. What would be some maybe strategies there with that you think could be useful with that, knowing that, you increase your protein intake, satiety is going to go up, but then after a while that starts to trend down a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. What I would encourage people to do when they're dieting is really carefully think ahead. Where are we going with this, right? So, um, we don't want to just enter a thing and say, I have no plan for the future. I'm just thinking about the week ahead. Sometimes that can be useful to get through a challenging time, to say, hey, one foot in front of the other. But when you're planning out a diet on the front end, I do think you want to put some thought into where is this going, right? So you have to understand that there are only so many levers that you get to pull over the course of that process. You want to think about, where am I now? Where am I trying to get in terms of weight loss or fat loss? Uh, how much protein do I need now? And what's the highest I can go down the road where I would feel like, okay, that's my upper limit. Because at a certain point, low calorie diet, high protein, you're forcing a lot of other foods out of the diet, right? There's going to be a practical upper limit, even if there's not a hard physiological upper limit. And so what I encourage people to do sometimes, and this is actually kind of counterintuitive. I don't know if I've ever talked about this publicly outside of just working like with one-on-one clients. But sometimes I'll encourage people to say, okay, we're starting the diet. What if we kind of stack the deck against our favor? Because when we're starting out a diet, usually the deficit isn't huge. We still have plenty of body fat. We shouldn't be really doing much of an uphill battle when it comes to hunger and satiety. So, what I say is, okay, well, let's use that and let's actually get used to a certain level of diet related satiety that gives us room to pull some levers as we go forward. So, early in a diet, we might put our protein at the lower end of the range that we want to be in. Not a low protein diet, but lower so that we have some room to build up as we go. We might have some more foods that are low on that satiety index, things that really aren't that satiating per calorie, things that have high energy density. We might even have more kind of like liquid calorie sources, or semi-liquid kind of softer calorie sources. Think of switching from an apple to applesauce, or an applesauce to apple juice. Foods kind of fall in this continuum. So we might start out on a diet that actually is intentionally not that helpful for satiety because we don't need to pull those levers yet. And so
Yeah.
we can actually get kind of used to feeling okay while dieting on a diet that is not designed to boost satiety. And what that does is, as we go forward, we have a larger number of levers that we can incrementally pull. And so we can get to a point where we say, you know what, we need to make some food swaps and focus on food texture. We need to go up that continuum from softer to harder. So that's a lever we can pull. Next, we say, okay, we still have some foods in the mix here with really high energy density. Let's swap those out for similar foods with lower energy density, and we can find some calorie reduction there. Pull that lever. We might have multiple steps throughout the diet where we gradually do a jump in protein intake, or we might find a place where we start to swap some of our protein sources, and we go from a protein beverage to a more solid form of protein. So it seems paradoxical, it seems counterintuitive, but sometimes I start and say, for lack of a better term, let's do this as wrong as we can as we start, and that'll give us some opportunities to ease, because at a certain point there's some psychology involved with dieting where you say, I've pulled every lever I can, and all I can do now is take this serving of food and make it smaller. And that is the last option here, right? And that is not a good place to
Yeah.
be. You'd like to be in a position where, as long as possible, you're going, oh yeah, I don't really mind switching from A to B. I don't really mind switching from B to C. You start making these swaps, and all of a sudden you say, wow, my calories way lower. My diet's way lower in calories than it used to be, and I actually still feel pretty all right. So I think we can leverage that really strategically.
Yeah, no, I like that. You kind of start a little bit lower, and we'll talk about like protein requirements and whatnot here in a minute. But I like that you start a little bit lower, and then as the diet goes on, you start to knowing that this does happen, you can start to increase your protein intake, and like you said, again, swapping for more like food volume type foods, lower energy density type foods, as the diet goes on, which I think that probably is what most people probably typically do. But the protein one I think is very interesting there, because it usually is typically, hey, just high protein, right? Go straight into high protein. So I guess off of that, what's kind of the time frame here on this in terms of that kind of adjustment period, and can it go back like later on? Like if you go a little bit high protein and then you go low protein, does it go back? What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, if memory serves, don't quote me on this, although podcasts are very quotable. I believe it's really only the span of a couple or a few weeks where we start to see an attenuation of that effect, where we say, oh, wow, yeah, that was fantastic. And it's not all at once, it's going to be kind of gradual in nature. But I do believe that it is repeatable, which is basically, yeah, you probably can drop back down for a period of a couple or a few weeks with your protein, jump back up, and you can probably replicate that experience, I would expect. So potentially you could argue in favor of perhaps a strategy where throughout the dieting process, um, I used to be very, very enthusiastic about diet breaks from a physiological perspective. I have fallen, my optimism has decreased a little bit for the physiological side of things, but I still find them to be helpful
Yeah.
from a psychological and behavioral perspective for some people. Not everybody. For some people,
Yeah.
they backfire and they say, I had all this momentum, you slowed me down, and I can't get it going again. And that is not a decision that should be taken lightly, to stop momentum in a weight loss process. I've seen it backfire way too many times. But anyway, yeah, you could potentially make an argument of, hey, maybe during a long weight loss journey here, a really long weight loss phase, perhaps we do these kind of 3 or 4 week diet breaks that are strategically planned around the calendar, maybe around the holidays, maybe around key social events, maybe around vacations, whatever. Maybe a 3 to 4 week diet break every so often, where we actually, because calories are coming back up, maybe we do drop protein and we see if we can kind of leverage that. I mean, that seems plausible to me. It's not something I've done, but hey, I mean, there's a lot of options with dieting.
Yeah, there are a lot of tools in the toolbox. No, I like that you mentioned that too, where you can potentially dial it back. But I agree with you on the diet breaks. Definitely, it's very dependent on the person, like you said. Where if you take that break, it's like he may be stopping that momentum, and it's going to be really tough to get that going again. So again, with protein, it sounds like, I think somebody would hear this and they probably think, oh, okay, well, I'll just keep adding more and more protein. But like you mentioned, the downside with that is you do end up you get into that constraint where you can't just keep adding more and more protein. Otherwise, you'll eventually get out of that calorie deficit, and then you'll go very low on, like you said, fats or carbohydrates. So there is kind of a limit to this as well. So I guess to stay on protein and kind of go to the other topic on protein is, and I know that you had this in one of your in one of the podcasts, was, does protein need to be as high as people say, right? I think that in the evidence-based field, it's 1 gram per pound of body weight or more. Anything less and you're going to miss out on muscle and stuff like that. So I'd love to just kind of chat about that a little bit more as well.
Yeah, so we in mass in the research review, we started doing these cover stories, and there was a big internal debate recently because I published an article about this topic, as well as doing a podcast segment on it. So I have a mass article on this topic, and the question was, should it be the cover story? And the cover story is published on Stronger by Science. It gets kind of broader circulation. And we eventually opted to do a different one. So instead of this one, we published my article as the cover story about there was a really surprising study that 85% of meta-analyses
Yeah.
in strength and conditioning had statistical errors, which is something I've been harping on for a really long time. So we went with that one. And that was the right call. But one of the things that made me nervous about this protein article was just like, do I have the capacity to deal with the vitriolic pushback that will
Yeah.
be coming, right? Because it does challenge a belief that a lot of people hold very, very dearly. But what I did in this article was, usually the evidence-based fitness community is going to give you a pretty standard range of, how much protein do you need to support hypertrophy? 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. And it's not hard to identify where that came from. It came from a very specific study that's highly cited, and it's a very good study. I don't want it to seem like I'm criticizing the study itself, but what's really interesting is what they were doing there is just kind of plotting out, okay, in these studies, who seems to be gaining more fat-free mass, who seems to be gaining less. Let's plot it against their protein intake and see if we can find a break point. And the break point that they found, where they say, okay, yeah, more protein leads to more gains until you reach this point, and then the relationship starts to flatten out. The break point they calculated statistically was at 1.6. And so a lot of people say, cool, that's our threshold, 1.6, easy enough. We got it. Evidence wins. Science is good. We're good. The thing is, so I really like statistics. I'm really into statistics. I do them a lot. But that doesn't mean that I'm always on team inferential statistics. I'm not always like, hey, we cannot do anything without a p-value attached to it or a formal statistical analysis. Sometimes I like to use my eyes. And sometimes I also like to use kind of like, more of a logical approach of like, well, what does that statistical outcome actually say? Like literally say. So the 95% confidence interval of that breakpoint reflects the uncertainty, right? So if we said, the breakpoint where this relationship goes flat is 1.6, and the 95% confidence interval is from 1.5 to 1.7, that means we have a very precise estimate. Like we feel really confident that 1.6 is where it happens, as long as all the assumptions of our statistical model are met. The 95% confidence interval in that study ranged from basically like 1.0 to 2.2, which was almost the entire range of the data in the figure. Like the lack of precision in it was basically like a a very conservative interpretation of that statistical procedure is there is a breakpoint and I promise it's somewhere. Like that's pretty much what that tells you, right? And so there's a number of studies similar to this one that have identified breakpoints that are in pretty similar areas. But one of the things about these breakpoint analyses is that there is a bit of, they're somewhat conservative in nature, meaning there's going to be a point in the plotted data where the relationship starts to flatten out, and we could say, okay, that's enough protein, enough is enough, there's no further benefit. But these procedures, the way they're designed, they don't want to call that prematurely. They want to actually see a pattern of flatness established before they say, okay, now we are statistically confident in saying that this flat relationship is flat enough to be flat. Okay, and I know that sounds absurd, but if you look at some of the figures, you can see, like you can look at the actual plotted data points and say, well, they began flattening out here, and the point that is identified by the model is considerably further along than that because there's this lag built into it because you don't want to jump the gun statistically. But your eyes can still tell you where this relationship is starting to become flat, right? Like, and so that's what I mean. I like statistics, but I also like contextualizing. Well, if there's a lag time and we're looking for like the real answer, like we can look at these data and get a pretty intuitive sense of where this started to flatten out, inferential statistics aside. So in this article, without going on and on and on, I basically looked at these models and said, okay, where's the break point? How precise is it? Usually not very precise. But more importantly, just visually, where do we see that people officially have enough protein, right? And what I did then is I framed my recommendations based on these observations, and I scaled them to fat-free mass rather than total mass. So I kind of did some back calculation because, frankly, when I started working on the macro factor diet app, it was no longer the case where I'm sitting down with an individual one-on-one and I can say, oh, okay, but yeah, I can tell based on your body comp, it doesn't really make sense for us to scale by total body mass because, these studies recruit people in this range, but you're outside of that range, right? So we need to kind of, do some adjustments. The best way for us to do that, it's not a perfect way, but the best way to do it is to scale it by fat-free mass, because that's going to be more indicative of how much protein you actually need. I mean, I don't think anyone would say, yeah, I'm going to do everything the same, gain 40 pounds of fat mass, and then my protein needs are going to go up dramatically. I don't think anyone would sign up for that claim or that assumption. So what I did was I looked for these breakpoints visually, and then I, kind of scaled them back to fat-free mass. And instead of creating a single breakpoint, I personally don't think we're ready for that yet, because I don't think there is a magic threshold that you cross and then everybody is good, right? So what I did was I actually broke it down into categories, and the categories were possibly sufficient protein intake, probably sufficient, and then almost certainly sufficient. And usually that 1.6 to 2.2 range, the way that's calculated would be almost certainly sufficient. Like if you're in this range, you're good. Like you're not leaving any gains on the table. You're fine. Probably sufficient is kind of a step down from that. That's the range where I say if you're leaving any gains on the table, first of all, it's pretty unlikely. And second of all, you may never actually be able to quantify it. It's going to like you're missing out on so little, like you're so close to optimal that the naked eye cannot distinguish between where you're at and optimal. Like you're so close that it's hard to even tell that you're not there. And then possibly sufficient. That's the range where I basically throw people a bone and I say, listen, you don't really like high protein diets. That's fine. But if you get into this range, you are absolutely going to be getting the lion's share of the gains that are available to you. Like for most people, you are getting most of your gains. You're going to make very satisfactory progress on this. Are you going to get optimal gains 100%? Maybe not, right? But this is a totally suitable protein intake for someone who wants to lift weights and make progress, right? So my possibly sufficient range is 1.5 That's where it starts. Grams of protein per kilogram of fat-free mass, right? So all you have to do there is take your body weight, estimate loosely your body fat percentage. You can use those to calculate how much fat-free mass you have in kilograms, and then you just multiply, right? So 1.5 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, not total mass. That's where I say you're eating good protein, should help you get some gains, very satisfactory progress. If you want to bump up to that probably sufficient range, instead of 1.5, you want to aim for 1.75. You want to bump it up a little bit. If you want to get to that almost certainly sufficient range, that's where you're going to be getting into like 2 to 2.75 grams of protein per kilogram of fat-free mass. And just to kind of loosely, if we take like a general average level of body fat, just to kind of give people an idea of where we're at here, that possibly sufficient range, we're talking above usually like 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of total body weight. Just to kind of give people both metrics here, so it's a little bit more contextualized. So that's in like the 1.2 range. Probably sufficient for most people is going to be like 1.4 grams per kilogram of body mass, and then almost certainly sufficient, like I said, that gets into the like 1.6 to 2.2, which is for most people what I would call like better safe than sorry. You're really not leaving any gains on the table at that point. How much protein you want is going to be depending on basically like what we've talked about, how much you want to leverage some of that stuff pertaining to satiety, appetite, things like that. So for a lot of folks, when they're entering a diet, I might start them maybe in the 1.75 or 2.0 range when we're talking grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. And I will kind of work them up from there, which I should say brings me to one kind of caveat. Dr. Helms, who's also Eric Helms, who's also a co-author of the Mass Research Review, published a great systematic review several years ago indicating that if you are very lean and you're dieting pretty hard, you have increased needs for protein if you want to maintain your fat-free mass, right? And so it's not hard to understand why Helms was interested in that. This dude loves bodybuilding. He's basically talking about when you're at the end of a prep and you're shredded and things suck and your calories are low, how much protein do you need to cling to every bit of muscle mass that you have, every bit of fat-free mass? So in that case, I basically bump these numbers up by like 0.35. So that 1.5, that lowest tier, that immediately bumps up to 1.85. That highest tier that starts at 2.0, that bumps up to 2.35. And so you might see someone who goes all the way up, if they really love protein, they're trying to leverage that satiety effect, they're really shredded, they're dieting really hard, you might see people get up to 3.1 grams of protein per kilogram of fat-free mass. So yeah, the thing that's interesting, like we talked about earlier, if you look at the entirety of this range and you're like, so someone who's just trying to make decent gains in an energy surplus, they might be down at 1.5 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. The opposite end of the spectrum is literally over double that at 3.1, right? So we have a lot of wiggle room here where it really just comes down to what are the stakes? How upset would you be if you got 92% of the gains on the table over the next 6 months instead of 100%? How much do you hate eating protein, right? There's a lot of individualized kind of preferences that can be factored into this, but that's kind of this broad range where you can then work down from there and figure out, okay, well, in this grid, where do I currently fall? Or where do I want to start and where do I want to end?
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it gives people more flexibility there with that, which I think is key because I think it is common, like, when people hear like, oh, you have to have this certain amount of protein. I think, like you said, there are people that just hate eating a lot of protein. Like I'm not a huge fan of just eating like lean protein all the time. Like I like it and I make sure each meal has some, but I also don't like having this massive amount of lean protein. Like I'd rather have carbohydrates and fats. I'm sure most people would, but I know for
Yeah.
me, it's the same thing. And it's nice to hear that, like, especially if you're in like a surplus, you're trying to gain weight, you can be a little bit more lenient there with that. You don't have to get that 1 gram per pound of body weight for sure. Like you could be a little bit lower
Yeah.
than that at certain times.
Yeah, and I mean, for a personal example, I started eating a vegan diet within the last year or so. you can get plenty of protein on a vegan diet, but it doesn't really suit my taste bud preferences all that well, which is a individual thing, right? So I'm not really eager to push my protein to the absolute higher limits, even though it is doable on a vegan diet. And then, like I said, I'm going to be entering when I really ramp things up closer to January. I'm going to be entering a phase where like I'm really detrained and gains are not going to be hard for me to come by at all. Like I'm going to have a lot of growth without having to do too much because that's the nature of retraining from a detrained state. So do I really need to ramp my protein up super, super
Yeah.
high to make progress? Absolutely not. Do I have an opportunity to maximize my progress by doing that? Absolutely, right? And that is kind of an interesting observation is that when people are really primed for precipitous, rapid growth, that actually is a good time where you can leverage higher protein intakes. Just the net balance of protein is going to be so high during that initial phase of muscle gain. You could argue that it's a really optimal time if you want to maximize gains to actually lean toward a higher intake. But if the goal is just, hey, I want to start making some gains right out of the gate and I don't want to stress over optimizing every little thing, dude, I could make incredible progress in the first couple months there, even if I was eating like the RDA, right?
Yeah.
Like 0.8 grams per kilogram, I'd still be fine because I'm going from detrained to lifting weights hard and it's gonna work. Like that's lifting works, which is good.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of the other reason I wanted to bring this up too, is because I think it's gotten like with protein, it's gotten so far to think that like people they almost place more emphasis on like getting protein in versus like actually lifting weights, and it's like
Yeah.
you have to send that signal to actually build muscle, So and that
Oh
was
yeah.
one of the main reasons why I wanted to bring this up too, because I think that's massive. Um, I guess
And
too.
if
Go
I
ahead.
could
Yeah,
support
go ahead.
that point, if you look at there's a lot of folks who, when they go on vacation, they're like, "Well, I don't have access to a gym, but I'm going to eat a ton of protein, and
Yeah.
it'll be fine." Dude, looking at the literature, it does literally nothing. I mean, it does not help at all. There is no question. Even like top protein researchers, Stu Phillips, they will tell you lifting weights, muscular activity stimulates growth. Protein is merely plays a permissive role, which what that means is if you're lifting weights and you intentionally severely restrict protein, yeah, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. But you cannot protein your way to gains in the absence of a muscular stimulus. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. That was kind of the point I wanted to bring up with this too, was that. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's yeah, you can't just protein your way to more muscle. I guess off this too, now somebody hears like, okay, I can kind of just take it really easy with protein, and whatnot. And we know that it's still important. I think probably one thing it does too, I'm just curious of your thoughts, is it probably does a good job of, and I think it was you that mentioned this in your podcast. It does a good job of displacing like other kind of tastier foods like carbohydrates and fats by aiming for a certain amount of protein. So I think that probably is something that you do want to be careful with as well. And that's one benefit of aiming for a little bit higher of a protein intake, is it does kind of force a higher quality diet, I feel like, as well.
Yeah, I definitely believe it sets the foundation for constructing meals that are compatible with a really healthy dietary pattern. So yeah, this is kind of the challenge of making this type of content, which is why I was like, maybe not the cover story.
Yep.
Maybe make that a deep cut for the real, for the diehard fans who are going to accept it, knowing where I'm coming from. But when you make this type of content, sometimes people want to kind of oversimplify it and say like, oh, so you're like a protein hater, you're the low protein guy,
Yep.
and that's not it at all. I Over the years, if you look back at my content, I think you'll see that I am so much less interested in telling people what they ought to do. I'm much more interested in helping people understand, if I do this, what effect can I anticipate based on the evidence, right? So I'm not saying, hey, everyone eating a bunch of protein, you should lower it. If you like it, there's really no reason to, broadly speaking. But what I am trying to identify with this type of work is, I mean, I've literally seen people who are on social media and they're like, oh my God, I hired this nutrition coach. Turns out it was a scam. This person's a dumbass. they gave me a protein target of 1.5 grams per kilogram. Everyone knows it has to be 1.6 if I'm going to make gains. And
Yeah.
it's like, dude, like you're 35% body fat and scaled to fat free mass, you are in the target range. And that target range is higher than it needs to be. Like it really just is based on the evidence. So, yeah, I basically just want to help people who feel like their arm is being twisted
Yep.
into a protein intake that's not compatible with their preferences. I want to say, are you really sure you need to be doing that? Because you certainly don't seem to be enjoying it. And it's very possible that you could make all the gains or 96% of the gains you're making with a diet that just makes your life way more, way more enjoyable. And so I want people to feel empowered to simply know the ramifications of the actions that they're taking in a way that's not hyperbolic.
Well, and even on the flip side of that too, you kind of mentioned, oh, this person has 1.5 kg. Now I'm gonna, lose all this muscle. That's way too low. But I feel like you also see on the flip side where like people will have nutrition coaches where they're just like, you got to get 3 grams per pound of body weight in for protein. And it's like, okay, that's a bit extreme too. And like you said, that just kind of goes back to the psychology of it. It's like that kind of really rigid approach to nutrition just is not going to help you see the results that you want like you think it will, and so I think again on that flip side, making sure like you also have some wiggle room there to where you don't have to go so high as well with it too, I think is important. Also on this too, and this was something you hit on, just to hit on this protein a little bit more. I know that you kind of mentioned you eat more vegan style now. I think you actually fully, but protein sources, I think that's another big thing too, because when somebody does raise their calories, you'll see, a little bit more come from like complementary protein. So, and people are like, oh, you have to, increase your protein intake to get it from complete sources. So I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on that a little bit as well too there.
Yeah, I mean, in a vacuum, like if you look at, you know, the suitability of totally vegan diets for supporting hypertrophy, muscle mass, there is a relationship where as total intake gets lower and lower, you do start to see bigger divergences where an omnivorous diet with higher quality protein sources, we can view it as being a more efficient protein intake pattern
Yeah.
for supporting muscle mass at lower intakes. But the question is, at what point does your total protein intake get so high that efficiency is no longer a problem? Where it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you're fine, you've got it covered. Much in the way that bumping your protein from 2 to 3 grams per kilogram, you're not getting any benefit from that. There is a certain threshold where we do start to see when protein intakes get high enough, as long as you have a reasonable mix of complementary protein sources, those differences between vegan and omnivorous diets, they just kind of wash away. And if you adhere to the targets that I laid out previously, especially if you get into the probably sufficient range or the almost certainly sufficient range, that is the area where I would say you're good. Like you're fine. And so, yeah, it's one of those things that is theoretically and academically a true point, but is practically alleviated by simply adhering to these protein targets.
Right. So yeah, once you like you said, if it's lower protein, you do have to be a little bit more careful with it. And like you said, more efficient. I like that. I think that's a good way to put it. Is you can be more efficient with your protein when it's more omnivorous at lower targets. And again, I think that's like you said. I think the big thing is just make sure you don't get like, for example, like something like beans. Just make sure all your protein isn't coming from that. Like, do make sure you're kind of switching it up a little bit, like some rice, some beans. I don't know how all those kind of work out, but again, making sure you're getting different sources of protein from those complementary sources.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The it's very convenient the way that they pair. So there's a lot of plant-based protein sources that lack lysine, and there's a lot of plant-based protein sources that lack methionine. And if you lack lysine, you tend to have plenty of methionine, and vice versa. So they work really well. And the thing that's convenient about it is that it's usually really nice meal pairings. Like they,
Yeah.
they just work out when you're like, what are two foods I'd like to pair? And it's if it's two plant-based, protein sources, they actually tend to be pretty complementary just by the way we like to eat. So you normally don't have to go too far out of your way, but there are some instances where if you lean really hard on supplements and all of the supplementary sources that you use lean really hard into one specific protein that happens to lack a key essential amino acid, such as methionine or lysine, then you do want to say, maybe I will mix it up a little bit. And so, like, one very basic thing I do to cover my bases there, I got from bulksupplements.com. I got some protein, right? And I got rice protein and I got pea protein, and those two are complementary. And I also got soy protein, which actually is a pretty complete protein source itself. And pea is pretty good too. But what I did is I got those three protein sources, all unflavored, and I just mix them together, 1 to 1 to 1, equal parts. And it creates this really great, nice, comprehensive mix of protein. And then throughout the day, I have some bean protein, I have some, pea protein, rice protein, lentils, chickpea. You start mixing in all these sources, soy, and you're good to go. I mean, you got to go pretty far out of your way to mess it up. You have to have a pretty not to make it sound judgmental, but you have to have a pretty atypical eating pattern if you're eating a high protein diet that's vegan to be really critically low on any particular essential amino acid. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. Again, I think that again just gives people more options with the protein. They're not, like you said, they're not twisted into one particular way of eating and whatnot. And there's some flexibility there, and I think that's great. So cool. Well, that kind of sums up the protein side of things. Again, like I said, I knew that was going to take probably longer than I thought it would, but we got a lot of good information in there. So I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and bring up another thing that commonly gets brought up, and I haven't had anybody on to specifically talk about it, and it's body fat readers and their limitations. And I bring this up because I do get a lot of people that come to me and they like either use like InBody or they use the thing that's on their scale, and they're like, hey, I don't really care what the scale says because it lies, but then I'm basing my progress off of what the InBody says. And so I just wanted to have somebody on here that knows the research and just can kind of talk about, maybe what they are and then the limitations of using them by themselves or just in general as well too.
Yeah, I'll make this really quick because I mean the conclusions are super straightforward and there's really not a lot of equivocation. Like with protein, there's all these
Yeah.
caveats and individualized things. This is one of the few topics where I give a very broad and bold statement, and it is when you're thinking about measuring your body fat, just don't. Across the board, period. Just there's no need, there's no value to it. And just to get like, I'm not one to kind of toot my own horn and say you should trust me because I'm an expert, but I will say this. The lab where I did my master's and my PhD, we really specialized in body composition research. We did a lot of it. There were some studies where the entire purpose was comparing a whole group of devices. That was the full purpose of the study, was bring in a person on the same day in the same conditions. They do BIA, they do BIS, they do bod pod, they do underwater weighing, they do ultrasound, they do DEXA, skin folds, you name it, they do all of it. And we compare those and we see how good are they at baseline compared to the best possible reference technique, and also how good are they at tracking changes. Because a lot of times people say, well, I know it's not going to give me a good number if I just hop on at baseline, but it'll give me good information about whether I'm losing fat or muscle or whatever. So I'll say this: body composition devices like, BIA is really rough. So any kind of handheld device, a bathroom scale that you step on, I wouldn't use that for literally anything in any context, group level, individual level, team level. I would never use it. The error is too high. There are too many ways to trick it. In a single day, you can drop your body fat 15-20%, literally just by messing with your hydration status. I wouldn't touch those. But other devices, when we talk about certain BIS devices, but more so when we talk bod pod, when we talk DEXA, things that you're going to see in research studies, things that maybe athletic teams are going to use, those are good at the group level. So if you're a football coach, I've talked to some football teams and said, yeah, if you do a DEXA for all your players early in the year and then do it again later in the year, you can get a good idea of, for the team, how are we doing with building muscle or maintaining or fat-free mass, maintaining fat-free mass, losing fat, whatever the goals are. We can do that at the group level. At the individual level, the errors are too high to get a good baseline number or to even get a good reliable change assessment. How well are we doing? And so the way that I like to frame it is this. And Greg actually has a great article. If you go to macrofactorapp.com/body composition with a hyphen between body and composition, great article that actually walks through examples of how misleading some of these numbers can be. But basically, I've had people in the lab, I measure them on five different devices on the same day, and their lowest number is 21% body fat, their highest number is 33. And they say, well, what's my body fat? I said, you tell me. I don't know, right? Like, I mean, we'll have a person who will come in and do one device, right? And so let's say they're going to do, a bod pod or something, and the bod pod says they're 20% body fat. Now, the bod pod says they're 20, or no, let's say they really are 20%, right? So we know somehow, even though we don't, we feel very confident that this person is 20% body fat. They hop in the bod pod. It could say 13. It could say 27. And so if I were to bring you in and say, okay, we're going to do this device and it's going to help us determine whether or not you're somewhere between 13 and 27% body fat. Does that tell you anything you knew before you walked into the room? Absolutely not. The error with these devices for an individual assessment, not a whole group of 100 people, but for an individual, because when you have a big group of people, the errors cancel out, things smooth out, you actually get a pretty good estimate. But for a single person, the range of errors envelopes and encompasses the entire range of plausibility, right? So like you basically get into a point where you say, oh, I lost 10 kilograms. I want to see how much of it was muscle, how much is fat. The entire range of plausible different, proportions in there are going to be fully swallowed by the error rate of the machine, right? And so pretty categorically, I can tell an individual. I can't think of a scenario where one of these tests or devices is going to tell you something that you didn't know before you did it. Your eyes can tell you plenty. If you really want to get more specific, use something that's more accessible and more simple. If you don't trust your eyes, you could use like the Navy formula where you just like measure some circumferences, put it into an equation. It'll say, yeah, you're about this percent body fat. Is it perfect? No. But I mean, yeah, usually what I like to tell people, so with Macro Factor, with the diet app, we do want to know what people's body fat is. We will not allow you to enter data from the scale. Like we do link up the scale so that you don't have to enter your body weight every day. It can just, Bluetooth automatically go in. We do not incorporate the body fat into the algorithmic portion of the app. You can track your body fat. You're allowed to do that, but we will not say, oh yeah, we'll just take that from your BIA scale and start altering your protein requirements based on it. Absolutely not, because the error is so big. We don't want it to mess with our algorithm. The error would just mess things up more than it helps. So the pretty simple thing is I just wouldn't use them. And I like, so here's an example. I knew all this, right? But I was in this lab that had all these devices. I was prepping for a bodybuilding show and I got really lean. Like this is when I earned my pro card and made my pro debut. But like I'm sitting there, I'm on campus like 16 hours a day. There's a DEXA sitting there. Yeah, I'm going to jump on and just see what's up. Yeah, what the hell, right? But I knew like, don't take this number seriously. This thing had me at 6% body fat. And a lot of people will tell you that DEXA often measures low relative to others. That's not necessarily the case. What you start to see with these devices is they are calibrated for kind of typical body fat ranges. So if you have really high or very, very low body fat, it's just a crapshoot. Like it's just like the error just gets enormous. So I got in there. It told me I was 6% body fat. I was like only somewhere between a half and two-thirds of the way through my prep. Like I lost 15 pounds as someone who competes at like 140 after it said I was 6% body fat. So based on that, if I took that initial measurement seriously and then assumed that I lost 15 pounds of fat from that, it's just not what happened, right? So yeah, that's my rant about body fat.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to, not glad, but I wanted you to kind of talk about, what the inaccuracies of it. And really at the end of the day, it's just, I feel like best case, it really tells you nothing, and worst case, it's going to get somebody to fall off track because they're going to see
Oh,
that number. They're going to see that number, and they're going to, maybe they lost 5, 10 pounds, but they're like, oh, I lost all this muscle too in the process. And it's like, okay, and so that's why I really caution people on using these things. I wanted you to kind of come on here. What would you say? You kind of hit on it a little bit, but if you're somebody that is really trying to improve your body composition, what would you say are better things to track? And like, what would you have somebody kind of pay attention to instead of the reader?
what I normally tell people is mirror, scale, performance, and clothing fit. Those four pieces of information are going to tell you everything you want to know. Hey, my shirt is tighter around the chest, looser around the belly, tighter around the arms. I think we're doing good. I like that, um, depending on the individual's goals, obviously. But um, those four things I really encourage, and I usually prefer to leave it there. Sometimes I will have folks who are just really numbers driven, and I don't like to extinguish that passion because that's not
Yeah.
helpful for anybody. So if you're really into numbers, really into quantification, tracking, I say, cool. There's a easy way and a slightly harder way with a higher barrier to entry. The easy way, go get a tape measure from a sewing kit, whatever, right? Like a tailor's kit. Any basic tape measure. Let's keep track of, forearm, bicep, thigh, hip, waist, just key circumferences. It's numerical. We can track it. If they want to go the slightly more nuanced route, they can do those circumferences, but pair it with caliper, skin fold. Like so, if you're to get your skin folds pinched for body fat assessment, though you can get kind of a cheaper pair of calipers, and you can then say, okay, well, if I know the circumference change and I know the change in the actual fat thickness, that layer of fat there, now I can make even more inferences about how much muscle is changing, how much fat is changing versus just, hey, bicep or I guess upper arm went from higher to lower circumference. It's a little more nuanced, but that's pretty much where I leave it. And like you said, I've had instances where um, I've had a client working one-on-one and they say, I'm going to go get a DEXA. And I sit them down before it and I say, I'm not just saying that I've done thousands of DEXAs, because I have, but I'm also saying I've literally done the research assessing whether the DEXAs are accurate, valid, reliable, whatever you want to call it. And I'm telling you, if this comes back, this DEXA result, and is just more positive than we could have ever possibly imagined, I am not going to take credit for that. But I'm also not taking blame if it's the end of the world, right? Now, I absolutely accept responsibility for your progress, but I do not accept responsibility for this number
Yeah.
because I've done too much research on this number to let it dictate how we assess our progress, because it's not fake, but it's certainly not reliable, right? It's a real thing, but it's not telling us what we think it's telling us. So I always tell people, I'll be fair. If you come back with a great DEXA, I'm not going to say, "Wow, I'm a wizard. How
But
did I
yeah,
do it?"
post
I
on your
don't
show
do that.
socials.
Yeah, I don't do that. But I also, when someone says, "Hey, yeah, I noticed that like my clothing fits better and I've lost weight and I look incredible in the mirror, but my DEXA says I lost 4 pounds of muscle and gained 4 pounds of fat." I say, no, no, you didn't. Like, you just didn't. And there's the things that we care about, and then there's this number, and there's a really big gap between the two. Because when you came to me, you wanted to feel more confident in your body, you wanted to put on muscle, you wanted to, fill in
Look
your shirt
better.
better, look better in the mirror. We are doing all those things.
Yep.
This number doesn't actually relate to those the way we expect it to.
Yeah, it's super weird how that happens, where it's like your main goal is just look better, you're looking better, and then you get that done, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, all that's out the window. But it's like at the end of the day, that's what you want, is you want to look better. So I guess then, if somebody, I think you kind of hit on this earlier, like you do ask for people's body fat. So do you just kind of have to go off of like look and like kind of guess a little bit? I mean, obviously we know that with the handheld device BIA, like you said, it could be 20%, it could be 13%, it could be 27. You just don't know. So how can you kind of get like a general idea of where you're at there with that? Or do you really we're just not gonna know at the end of the
I
day?
mean, there's really simple ways to do it. Like I said, you could do the Navy formula
Maybe.
with circumferences. You can do a visual assessment. That's what I like to do.
Yeah.
I've with between the bodybuilding stuff and all my body comp research I've done, I trust my eyes about as much as any device.
Yeah.
So you could do Navy, you could just eyeball it. You could even use a very basic formula. It's not a perfect formula by any means, but you could use a basic formula if you're really desperate and you just don't trust your eyes to convert BMI to a body fat estimate. Very messy, not precise, not good, not great. But there are ways to do it. But the reason I like the eyeball version is because you can look up plenty of those. I'm sure you've seen the grids where it's like, what is,
Yeah.
there's usually one for male, one for female. What does someone look like when they're 5%, 10%, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, all the way on? What you can do with a visual assessment like that is typically get within about 5 percentage points. And I don't know of any reason that you would actually need to be more
Accurate.
precise than that, because like
Mhm.
what we're trying to do is figure out how much total fat free mass do you have, right? If we're off by a couple little percentage points here and there, it doesn't actually change the
Yeah.
recommendation that much, and the recommendation isn't even precise enough that we can say, oh, it's definitely got to be exactly 1.75 grams. But so we're talking about a rough estimate here to use for a rough estimate there for protein intake. And so there's really no value in sweating over the details. And usually what you'll find is once we start to say, okay, how much protein do you need? We'll get a rough estimate and we say, okay, well, how much protein do you like?
Yep.
And that is where we start to actually change things anyway. So yeah, I just don't see a need in most cases to do anything more precise than just eyeballing it.
Yep.
And if you can't eyeball it, you can use one of those kind of pictures. Um, that's what we do in Macro Factor when you're signing up, or if you want to go in and adjust your body fat. We present it as ranges, and there are visual. Kat Whitfield did these illustrations for us. They really look great. She did a fantastic job with them, but it's just a visual. Where do you fall in here? Pick the category, right? And so over time, you might shift from one category to another, but it really gets us close enough to do everything we're trying to do with that number.
Yeah, no, I love that. And like you said, you don't need to know the exact number anyways. I think it's just, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's like you can brag about it. I'm not sure what it is, but people want to know that number down to a T. But like you said, looking at yourself in the mirror is going to be probably the best thing that you can do there with that. That's going to tell you more than anything else. So cool. Let's dive into the last topic here. I know that you've talked about this a lot, and then you had a new article that came out. Is a research brief in Mass about high body fat levels still don't blunt hypertrophy. So I'm just kind of curious to hear, kind of where you stand on this, and yeah, we'll just go from there with it.
I thought the title would give it away.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is kind of an ongoing saga. So there has been an idea in fitness for a while that if you have high body fat, it will influence something called a P ratio. And we're just going to talk about it in terms of bulking up, just for simplicity. But the P ratio is, let's say you gain 10 pounds of weight. The P ratio is, okay, well, of that 10 pounds, how much was muscle or lean mass rather than fat mass, right? And so if you have a high P ratio, let's say you gain 10 pounds, 8 pounds of it was muscle, only 2 pounds of it was fat. If you have a low P ratio, you gain 10 pounds, 2 pounds was muscle, and the other 8 pounds was fat. So P ratio, we're usually talking about it in the context of bulking up in the fitness world. And there is this idea that if your body fat starts to get high, it will negatively impact your P ratio, which by my estimation approximately suggests it would impair hypertrophy, right? Because I don't think anyone's saying, well, once you have a high body fat level, you just can't gain weight anymore. You can, but they're saying, well, of the weight you gain, less will be, muscle. So it seems to be indicative of an impairment of hypertrophy, relatively speaking. That seems to be the claim, is if your body fat gets high, it's going to be harder to build muscle, and then you have to overeat disproportionately more to gain the same amount of muscle, and then your body fat gets even higher, which amplifies the problem, and it's just this kind of really nasty cycle. That mechanistically has been pinned to two ideas. One is that as body fat goes up, insulin sensitivity goes down, insulin resistance goes up, and insulin plays a role in shuttling nutrients to muscle tissue. So, one idea that is largely falling out of favor, I don't know too many people who are willing to get on board with this anymore. One idea that got popular for a minute there was if your body fat gets high, because of that effect on insulin sensitivity, you're just not going to get nutrients into your muscles and they're not going to grow. Like I said, I don't know a lot of people who would still get on board with that. It's been pretty soundly disproven. Even people who a couple years ago were on board with it are like, maybe not my best. The other argument pertains to inflammation, just kind of systemic baseline inflammation. It is true that there are a number of things that can increase systemic inflammation. So aging is one of them, being very sedentary is one of them, and having a high amount of body fat is one of them. And so the idea is there is strong evidence that very high levels of inflammation attenuate muscle growth. They are not good for hypertrophy. So the theory is if you gain some body fat, then inflammation will go up, and that will attenuate your ability to build muscle when you have a high body fat level. One of the things I find challenging about that argument is when you ask someone to support it with evidence. And you'll see a lot of stuff. You'll see studies about overtraining. You'll see studies about menopause. You'll see studies about aging. You'll see studies about severe illness and injury that causes hospitalization. But one thing that you definitely won't see is obesity-induced inflammation attenuating hypertrophy. So like there's this kind of shell game that people like to play when they're supporting this mechanistic argument. They say, well, if you look at this paper in elderly individuals, they have inflammation and they don't grow as much muscle as younger folks. Therefore, if you have high body fat, you will also have high inflammation and you will not grow muscle as much as a leaner person. The problem there is that inflammation exists and can be quantified. And so I often say, well, show me this clear relationship by which a certain percentage increase in body fat causes a rise in inflammation that is analogous to the inflammation seen in hospitalization or the elderly or all these different circumstances. Show me an instance where obesity causes that and then impairs hypertrophy. And it's not been shown, and no one's willing to lead me to it. I don't believe it exists. Now, there are plenty of studies showing that people with high and low body fat gain the same amount of muscle and lean mass when they do the same training program. And to me, that seems like it's a pretty open and shut case. So the first article I did about this, we did what we call a participant level or individual level meta-analysis, which is not fun. I can't stress that enough. It's not fun. It's not easy to do. So with a meta-analysis, you combine the results of several different studies, right? And then you pool them all together and you do this kind of big combined pooled analysis of the results of several studies. But normally you're taking one number, or I guess two numbers from a study, the mean and the standard deviation for the whole group of people. With a participant level meta-analysis, you actually go in and get the raw data, every single participant in the study, and you jam it into a giant data set. You do a linear mixed model so that you can kind of parse out all the different layers of dependency, all the different correlated layers of data within this bigger data set. So you want to make sure that people in the same study are being handled accordingly. You want to make sure that people in the same treatment group are being handled accordingly, because there are some correlations among those layers of data that statistically best practice is to deal with them usually via random effects in a linear mixed model. That's enough of the stats talk. But we did the analysis by the book, the way, kind of best practices statistically, gathered all this data. And we showed very conclusively, in my opinion, big group of people, giant range of body fat, people who had higher body fat at baseline did not have an attenuation of hypertrophy. The only difference in body composition changes was that people who started these resistance training interventions with higher body fats, they typically gained the same amount of muscle, the same amount of fat-free mass or lean mass. The only difference was they also happened to lose fat during the trial. And so what that tells us is hypertrophy was not attenuated, and in fact, their P ratio was improved. When we talk about the discrepancy between change in fat-free mass and the change in fat mass, the empirical evidence really contradicts this concept every which way. And the only way to kind of hang on to this argument still is to say, I instead of trusting empirical observations that directly assess this relationship, I instead am going to use aging or hospitalization as a proxy for obesity, which is a very indefensible position to take when we have, like, that stance indicates that no one has bothered to assess hypertrophy in people with varying levels of body fat, which is it's not a defensible stance to take. We have so much hypertrophy data in people that are 8% body fat and people that are 58% body fat and everything in between. And when you look at the empirical data, there is no reason for us to believe that this P ratio hypothesis really exists or matters in a meaningful way. And you might be wondering, well, surely there must have been some empirical basis for this, right? And really, like, a big portion of what was driving this was there was an observational look at weight regain in folks of varying body fat levels. And so, like, most of the sample in this initial paper, first of all, no one was lifting weights. And I don't want to get in the practice of making hypertrophy inferences based on people who are not stimulating hypertrophy in any way. That makes no sense to me when we have countless studies where people lift weights. So no one is lifting weights. The leaner people in this original paper that kind of gives birth to this idea there's kind of two groups. There was a bunch of folks who were recovering from anorexia nervosa, which obviously involves the atrophy of lean tissue. Muscle mass, organ mass is atrophying. And so, of course, when they start regaining weight, they're going to be undoing some of that atrophy of really dangerously low levels of fat-free mass. We have every reason to expect that they should regain some fat-free mass when they simply start going back to more suitable calorie intakes that are healthier. The other groups of people in the study are people who were doing extreme starvation diets, starting with BMIs in the 40s, 50s, and beyond, right? And we're talking about people who are doing extreme interventions, who are losing 40, 50, 60 kilograms in these weight loss trials. And then I believe the model, I could be mistaken, I believe they also used the raw data from the Minnesota starvation experiment, which obviously was a very, very extreme approach to dieting that involved a great deal of atrophy as well. And so basically a lot of folks have gone into this saying, let's assume that the refeeding experience of someone recovering from anorexia nervosa who is not lifting very effectively mimics changes in body composition from a normal weight individual who's lifting weights. I reject it out. Like, some people want to get on board with that, by all means, but not me. I'm not doing that. I'm not signing up for it. So yeah, that's kind of the heart of it. And so basically, you alluded to that research brief, and it was just another piece of empirical evidence saying, yeah, we have absolutely no reason to believe that the baseline fat mass is predictive, or certainly no reason to believe that it is going to attenuate hypertrophy over the course of a resistance training program. And the reason that I reviewed that research brief en masse was because I do believe it filled in, if there was a gap in the argument, you could maybe argue that in our initial participant level meta-analysis, we used all the data we had, but it was a lot of people who were kind of like typical body weight ranges, body fat ranges for a lifting study, college kids basically. And they do tend, those populations tend to have lower body fat than, the kind of classical, the kind of classical population you'd see in a study about obesity where BMIs are 30, 35, 40. So this new study that I briefly covered in mass was looking specifically at individuals with higher BMIs. So you could have said our initial analysis, oh, we missed the effect because the people were too lean. Then this study comes along, really good meta-analysis, huge sample, much higher BMIs, same thing. High body fats are not attenuating hypertrophy.
Yeah. And I think just like with the protein thing now, it's like people hear that and they're like, oh, okay, so Eric says you can just gain a bunch of weight and still like, I'm sure there's still this point where it's like, okay, again, it just gives you options to where you don't feel like you have to necessarily be like, hey, I have to get to a certain body fat level and then I can start like trying to build muscle, right? Like you can do this really at any point. And I'm sure that's what you were trying to make with this point. So I guess again, somebody hears this and they're like, okay, so Eric's saying just I can just gain a bunch of weight and build muscle and whatnot, right? I'm sure that there's a certain point where you're just like, okay, there's some downsides to continuing to gain weight, even though you're trying to build muscle. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on kind of on that.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of comes back. I mentioned previously that I, at some point in my fitness career, got completely out of the business of telling people what to do, telling people what they should value, what they should prioritize. I'm out of that game. And so, you know, when during a bulk is your body fat too high? Well, I mean, are you a strong safety who plays American football or a defensive end or an offensive tackle? Now we've opened up very different ranges for where body fat is a little bit higher than you would anticipate or consider optimal for the physiological demands of the thing you're trying to do, the thing you are bulking for. If you are a super heavyweight strongman, I think you should feel comfortable gaining some weight because it looks like the folks who do pretty well there are often 375 pounds,
Yep.
So if you're like, well, I don't want to get over 220, well, that's going to be
Good luck.
tough. Yeah. Sumo is a sport. I'm not going to go tell a sumo lifter, you should probably try to maintain visible abs because like that fits my set of priorities and therefore should fit yours too. It's not compatible with what they're doing, with what they're trying to achieve. And so, yeah, a lot of people kind of, the article was very well received. A lot of people basically just responded by, yeah, that's all good, but I don't want to be above
Yep.
15% body fat. And I said, well, here's the beautiful thing. You don't have to. Like, yeah. So, I mean, like, yeah, a small percentage of people thought that I was saying, oh, yeah, like just, bulk as high as you possibly can, ignore all other priorities. You know, your success in life is dictated by one number, and it's how high is your scale weight. That's obviously not what I'm arguing, right? But I think people should feel free to pursue fitness in the way that is appropriate to them. And so, like there were a lot of people who compete in strength sports in like super heavyweight categories who are like, wait a minute, am I actually hindering my progress by not doing really frequent fat loss phases? And it's like, well, no, the frequent fat loss phases are probably not going to be great for your training if your goal is to be the strongest super heavyweight strongman or power lifter in the world. And that, people should not be misled to believe that otherwise, so the purpose is trying to inform people about, again, what does the evidence say will happen if you choose
Yeah.
a particular path? And one of the places where this comes in really handy to me, probably the most important to me, or I wouldn't say most important, everything's important to the individual, but the most prevalent use case of this argument, most prevalent application or common application is there are so many folks who are new to fitness and they say, I self-identify as being skinny fat. I want to lose fat. I want to lose a considerable amount of fat, but I also want to gain a considerable amount of muscle. I have been told that the only correct path forward is to start with fat loss and then try to gain muscle after.
Yep.
Now, that is potentially incompatible with the weight regain literature, which would indicate it can be kind of hard to regain exclusively lean mass after a considerable fat loss process. So that's a different conversation altogether. But to me, that's a critical period in someone's fitness journey. I'm just getting started. I have two goals that I'm passionate about, but there's one that I'm very enthusiastic about and would be much more enjoyable. And there's another that I do want to tackle eventually, but not quite yet. We should not force people into a predetermined sequence that is not based on evidence that forces them to tackle the goal out of two that they are least excited about, least passionate about at this moment in time. And I do think you do someone a tremendous disservice if they come to you and say, "Yeah, I consider myself skinny fat. I don't really love that term, but it's common. The clinical or kind of research term would be normal weight obesity, right?
Yeah.
But someone will say, "Hey, I want to lose fat and I want to gain muscle. I'm really excited about lifting right now, and I really just kind of want to get huge." But I feel like people are saying I have to do fat loss first. And the answer is you don't. And if you force that person into doing fat loss first when they're just kind of constantly looking to the other side of the fence where the grass is greener and saying, "Oh, I could be bulking right now. I could be getting so big and strong, but instead I'm eating these leaves on this plate and I hate this." You're going to extinguish their passion, their enthusiasm. They're never going to fall in love with fitness, or you're reducing the likelihood that they will really fall in love with it from the outset. And it is possible that you're setting themselves up for a less successful long-term trajectory because you could stifle their motivation enough to stop that process in its tracks. And to me, that is really a shame.
Well, I like too that you kind of mentioned this there where it's like if you pick one or the other, you have them lose weight, and that's in that specific situation. It's like you said, the research actually shows that they're probably going to still gain some fat on the way back up anyway. So might as well just get them lifting right then and there. But I also liked how you brought up the kind of comparison of like, hey, are you a safety in football? Or are you a offensive lineman? Like that's going to play a big role in terms of how big you need to get. Like you said, I think really the big thing comes down to, and I wonder if this is kind of where people get this in their head is like, obviously the higher your body fat is, the less you're going to see your muscle. It's just not, you're just not going to look as great. Right. And I'm assuming that's probably where most of this like confusion comes into play here with all this and why people think that when they're higher body fats, they can't build as much muscle, but it just literally is, you just can't see it as much probably.
No, that's true. I mean, yeah, in the bodybuilding world, especially natural bodybuilding, there's all these folks with a decent amount of muscle, but until they cut, it doesn't really look that,
Yeah.
eye popping. And like, I forget the exact phrase, but a lot of people say if you want to look like you gain 5 pounds of muscle, the best way to do it is lose 5 pounds of fat, something like that. But yeah, that is a true thing. And I'm actually really open to a variety of paths. And so, like, sometimes we treat it as like bulk or cut. I'm actually often open to the possibility when someone's new, they're just getting into this stuff. They usually have a high potential for recomposition, which is simultaneous muscle gain and fat loss. And that's a great way to get
Yep.
people really excited because they can see you might not maximize their rate of weight gain or rate of muscle gain, and you might not maximize their rate of fat loss simultaneously, but you can make meaningful strides toward both for someone who's just starting out in their journey and has some body fat to lose. And what I often find is that is a great way to start. So what you do is you say, okay, you're motivated, you want to do both these things. Guess what? We can.
You can.
So let's do that. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to clean up your diet a little bit. We're going to focus on some basic stuff, get enough protein. Doesn't have to be a ton, as we've discussed, but get enough. Clean up the diet a little bit, get excited about that, and really get excited about going into the gym and seeing what your body can do. Like, let's find a program we love and let's excel. And let's enjoy the process of building that confidence and watching your body adapt and do things that you couldn't do previously. Like that is the best way to really help someone fall in love with fitness and set them up for a lifetime of fitness versus saying, "Hey, that thing you don't want to do? Actually, we're doing that first." So, good luck. Hope you love it. If you love it enough to stick with it, maybe this will work out. If not, sorry.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think a lot more people can recomp than what they think. and so, yeah, I love that. So Eric, taking up plenty of your time. I think I might turn this into 2 episodes. We'll see. I'm TBD on that.
Yeah, I talk too much.
No, that's exactly what I wanted. So no, I think there's a ton of great information in here. But I guess before I let you go, is there anywhere where you want to lead the audience to? This will probably be out in 2 to 3 weeks. So just keep that in mind with any of that.
Yeah, let's see. If you want to find what I'm up to, you could go to strongerbyscience.com. You could go to macrofactorapp.com. You could check out the Mass Research Review, or you could find me personally on social media. I'm most active on Instagram. And by most active, I mean, I use that very loosely. I exist. I check DMs sometimes on Instagram, and my handle is at Trexler Fitness.
Cool. Perfect. Awesome, Eric. We'll have to get you back on here again at some point. But obviously probably won't talk to you before the holiday. So have a good holiday and we will talk to you soon.
Yeah, happy holidays.